The storm hit harder than any in living memory, wind like cannon fire, snow like smothering ash. But deep in the Wyoming hills, one cabin stood untouched, and the man inside had spent 5 years preparing for this very night. Before we begin, tell us where you're listening from, and if stories of survival speak to you, subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The blizzard came in silence. Then it screamed. By dusk on January 17, 1871, the wind howled so loud along the mountain ridges that trees bent like river reeds, and dry powder snow moved in great sheets across the flats. It was the kind of storm old-timers warned about, but few alive had ever actually seen. On that first night alone, over a dozen cabins along the Green River Valley collapsed under the weight of snowpack and roof ice. The air snapped with cold, sharp enough to peel the skin from your lips. Entire families scrambled through chest-deep drifts, crying out, their homes cracking apart behind them. But one cabin stood still. Tucked on a rise above Moose Creek, a structure that looked more like a buried hull than a house was lit by the steady pulse of firelight from within. The wind battered its angled roof, but the snow slid right off. Inside, Elijah Cormack sat cross-legged on a wooden platform, a kettle of boiled pine bark tea in his lap. His breath was visible, but his fingers weren't numb. He wasn't afraid. 5 years earlier, he would have been out there too, scrambling, praying, bleeding. But that was before the night the roof gave way. Now he listened. The blizzard tore at the world, but it couldn't find a way in. Every crack had been sealed, every angle thought through, every log chosen by hand. The air was still and heavy with the scent of smoke and resin. Somewhere outside, another roof collapsed. It was unmistakable. A deep, muffled whump, followed by what Elijah imagined was silence or screaming. He looked toward the far wall where a thick timber beam supported the cabin's spine. Notched into it were small carvings, just 5 lines. One for each winter since the cave-in, one for each year he'd spent learning how not to die when snow turned cruel. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel vindicated, but he wasn't surprised either. This was what he'd built for. It had been March when the first cabin failed him. The snow that year came late, light at first, then suddenly, all at once. Elijah and his partner Jonas Bell had spent the early season trapping fox and beaver in the lower valleys. Their cabin near Split Tooth Ridge had been built in 5 days. It was crude, like all first-season builds: notched logs, cedar bark roof, a stone-lined fire pit, and packed mud for chinking, enough to stay dry, enough to call shelter, or so they thought. The night the roof caved in, Elijah woke to a strange quiet. No wind, no creaks, just an unbearable pressure in the air. Then the roof sagged with a crack, like bone, and everything came down at once: snow, beams, bark, and a log that struck Jonas square across the chest. Elijah clawed his way out half-naked, lungs burning, blood already freezing on his fingers. Jonas didn't make it. When the sun rose, Elijah stood outside the wreckage, frostbitten and shaking. Jonas was still inside, buried. The storm had passed, but something worse had settled in Elijah's chest. The knowledge that it hadn't been the storm that killed his partner. It had been their cabin, their choices, their shortcuts. He buried Jonas by the river, stacking stones in silence. That spring, Elijah didn't go back to trapping. He went back to the wreckage. He pulled it apart log by log, studying the breaks, the angles, the failure points. He kept a small journal, drawings, questions, wind patterns, snow loads. He spoke to old men. He sat in the back of general stores listening to talk about ridge beams, roof pitch, and the right way to build. Most men said the same thing: storms happen, nothing you can do, part of mountain life. Elijah didn't agree. He bought tools he didn't yet know how to use. He walked into forests and measured tree trunks with string and stick. He slept rough under canvas to watch how snow collected and melted. He built models, miniature frames out of kindling, and crushed them with rocks to see how they failed. And by the time the next winter came, he wasn't just a trapper anymore. He was a man with a plan and a quiet vow he never spoke aloud. Never again would a roof fall with someone he loved underneath it. The answers didn't come from books. They came from snow. Elijah stopped trapping entirely the following year. He built no cabin. He traveled light, carried tools instead of pelts, and spent entire days watching how the land shifted under the weight of winter. Where most men saw weather, Elijah saw architecture, nature's brutal testing ground. He studied how snow gathered on spruce limbs but slid off pine. He watched abandoned trapper shacks collapse beneath icicles that lengthened like knives. He marked where the wind carved drifts, where the sun never touched. Every failure became a kind of teacher. In spring, he built a frame, not a cabin, just a skeleton. 4 walls and a pitched roof set in a clearing near Moose Creek. It wasn't meant to last. He wanted to see how it broke. He left it out through thaw and rain, through freeze and melt, and by autumn it had twisted on itself. The ground had shifted. The joints had warped. Elijah knelt beside it for hours, running his fingers over the places that split. He didn't take notes anymore. The mountain didn't speak in ink. Instead, he started over, dug trenches by hand where frost wouldn't creep, learned which rock held its shape in ice, shaved bark from logs and rolled them until their grain revealed whether they'd bow or stay true. He learned to read trees like some men read the sky. He spent an entire week testing angles for roof pitch. He laid logs across beams and shoveled snow onto them, too flat, and it piled dangerously, too steep, and the wind caught like a sail. Somewhere in between, somewhere just right, he found balance. It was a slope no one else used. It looked strange, but it shed snow like a water wheel, and that was enough. The mountain didn't reward pride. It punished assumptions. Elijah listened. He stopped calling it building. He started calling it joining. Logs didn't just stack. They leaned into one another. Stone didn't sit. It held. Weight had to travel like water, down, out, balanced. By year's end, Elijah had built 4 more frames, each more refined than the last. They looked less like cabins and more like wooden ships grounded in soil, ribs, keels, beams like spines. He was building not for warmth or comfort, but to stand against movement, time, and pressure. Other trappers passed through, gave him strange looks. "You building a church or a barn?" one joked. Elijah didn't answer. Let them laugh. He wasn't building for them. He was building for the night the wind didn't stop. The idea came from a broken sled. It was the winter after Jonas died. Elijah had salvaged a shattered freight sled from a crash on Devil's Trail. Thick timbers splintered at the runners, but curved upward like a boat hull. As he dragged it back to camp, he kept staring at the arch. It had buckled, yes, but it hadn't snapped. The curve had taken the load, flexed, and failed without shattering. That, he realized, was the answer. Buildings didn't need to resist force. They needed to absorb it. That spring, Elijah drew the first plans for what he would call the rib cage. He cleared a spot on high ground, above the flood line, facing east to catch morning warmth. The cabin would be narrow and long, unlike the square footprint most men used. The roof would start low, then rise steeply like the back of a spine. From a distance, it would look wrong. But Snow, he knew, didn't care about appearances. Each roof beam was hand-hewn from straight pine, curved slightly from saplings grown on a slant. He laid them close, only 12 inches apart. Most cabins used wide spacing to save wood and time. Elijah didn't care. He pegged each beam through the ridgepole using iron spikes salvaged from wagon wheels. He braced them crosswise, creating a lattice that distributed weight like a woven basket. When it was done, the roof looked like an inverted canoe, tight, steep, ribbed. It was overkill. It was perfect. But Elijah wasn't done. He layered bark first. Birch, peeled and cured, overlapping like shingles. Then canvas soaked in pine resin. Then, on top of everything, sod, living grass, held together by roots and frozen soil. It was weighty, dangerously so, but his walls were ready. He'd overbuilt them for this. And most importantly, the pitch was steep enough that snow rarely stayed longer than a day. It was a roof that bent, notched beams allowed slight movement. Pressure from snow caused the structure to tense, not snap. During one trial, he sat inside during a test storm and listened to the creaks and groans like a choir of old trees. But the roof held. All was held. Other trappers stopped by. Some watched in awe. Others mocked. "Looks like a Viking ship flipped upside down," one said. Elijah smiled. That was fine. The sea and the mountain both punished arrogance, both rewarded design. By winter's return, the roof had endured 4 minor storms without so much as a shift. The cabin stayed dry, warm, and intact. Elijah slept soundly, listening not for collapse, but for the silence of success. Because when snow fell like stone and the wind screamed like judgment, his roof didn't fight, it breathed. What Elijah built next wasn't a cabin frame, at least not in the way anyone on the frontier understood it. It was something older, sturdier, shaped from principles no trapper had ever bothered to study. He believed a structure couldn't simply rest on the land, it had to anchor into it. The mountains shifted, expanded, froze, cracked. Most cabins fought that movement and lost. Elijah designed his frame to move with the earth, not against it. He began by digging down, far deeper than any trapper would waste time with. He carved a shallow trench across the cabin's entire footprint and filled it with layers of gravel and stone, tamped meticulously until the ground itself felt firm beneath his boots. Frost wouldn't heave this foundation. Water wouldn't pool. The soil could shift, but the base would remain stable. A cabin built on uncertainty was doomed. A cabin built on stone survived. Next came the walls. Elijah refused to notch logs, just as he refused to trust guesswork. Notched corners, he knew, created leverage points. Under snow load, they shifted. Under wind, they creaked. Under ice, they cracked. He wasn't building the kind of shelter where one weak joint could turn a storm into a death sentence. Instead, he shaped each log by hand. He stripped bark, shaved edges, and used a draw knife to make surfaces mate cleanly. The corners were joined with mortise and tenon joints, rectangular cutouts chiseled into the wood like the joinery he'd once seen in a church attic back east. Each joint was locked with hand-carved pegs hammered through multiple timbers at once. A modern builder might have called it over-engineered. Elijah called it necessary. The frame rose slowly, deliberately. Every log tested for straightness, soundness, grain. When a log didn't ring right under his mallet, he discarded it. When one bowed under pressure, he set it aside for firewood. The walls grew thick, thicker than any normal cabin, and the joints grew tighter. When he ran his hand along the seams, he felt almost no gaps. The structure wasn't just strong, it was monolithic. Inside, he built support posts more commonly found in barns or mills. He cut crossbeams and braces, forming triangles at every possible stress point. Most trappers didn't know the word truss. Elijah didn't either, not formally. But he understood the principle instinctively. Strength was in distribution, not bulk. A roof's weight didn't belong on the walls alone. It belonged across an entire skeleton. When the frame was finally complete, Elijah stepped back and studied it from a distance. It didn't look like a frontier cabin. It looked like a timber fortification, something meant to outlive men, storms, and time itself. The wind rose that night, rattling trees and sending snow swirling. Elijah listened from beneath an unfinished roof as his frame took its first breath. It creaked, but it held, firm, grounded, immovable. This wasn't a home, it was a promise. Heat was the next problem, one most men solved with a bigger fire, more wood, and a cabin that smoked like a forge. Elijah had lived through enough winters to know that heat wasted was heat lost. And heat that escaped through walls, floors, and roofs wasn't just wasteful. It was deadly when temperatures sank low enough to freeze a man's breath midair. The core idea came to him while thawing his boots by a creek. Snow had insulated the stones along the bank, trapping warmth underneath. The fire he built nearby radiated downward, not upward. Heat moved in unexpected ways. Elijah studied that pattern for days, crouched over coals, watching frost melt unevenly on the ground. He realized most trappers built fires in the wrong place entirely. They put heat where it escaped fastest, high in the room, up the chimney, into the night. So Elijah built differently. He started with the floor. Using flat stones he hauled from Moose Creek, he laid a shallow bed across the cabin's foundation. Beneath the stones, he created narrow channels, vents carved from packed earth and lined with smaller stones. These led to a low firebox built into the east wall. Instead of rising, heat would travel through the floor, warming stone first, air second. It was crude, radiant heating, born not from books, but from long observation of how heat lingered in places fire never touched. The hearth itself was small, half the size of a traditional trapper's fireplace. The chimney rose narrow and tall, built from layered stone with a smoke shelf carved into the throat. It drew cleanly, without downdrafts, and burned hot without spitting sparks. A thin copper sheet salvaged from a broken still lined the back of the firebox, reflecting heat downward and outward instead of letting it vanish into the stones. Elijah tested every detail. One morning in late autumn, with the first frost glimmering across the meadow, he lit the fire for the first time. He watched coals settle, felt heat rising not from the flames, but from the stone beneath his boots. Within an hour, the cabin's interior warmed evenly, no cold corners, no choking smoke, no frantic feeding of the hearth. And because the firebox burned smaller, he used a third of the wood most trappers burned by midday. But the true test came later. After extinguishing the fire, Elijah checked the floor at dawn. The stones still held warmth. Even in bitter cold, the cabin breathed heat slowly, gently, never overheating, never freezing, just steady, dependable warmth. Word of his hot floor traveled fast. Men scoffed. Others demanded to know how he'd done it. Elijah didn't explain, not because he wanted secrecy, because he'd learned the mountain's lessons the hard way. You didn't understand heat by hearing about it. You understood by surviving it, and Elijah intended to survive every winter the mountain had left in it. The final feature Elijah added wasn't structural, it was strategic. Most frontier cabins had one door, maybe two if built by settlers with families. One heavy plank slab, maybe hung with leather hinges, maybe with a wooden bar for security. Elijah had built those kinds of doors before. They were fine for summer, but in winter they leaked warmth like a sieve. Open once, and all the heat fled like a bird through a broken window. And in a storm, one gust could blow snow clear into your bedding. Elijah had another idea. He'd seen it once at a military outpost while passing through Fort Laramie. 2 doors, separated by a small, enclosed space. An airlock. A buffer zone. It was meant to slow soldiers' entry and exit, to keep the elements out and the warmth in. Now he built one of his own. He framed a small vestibule at the front of the cabin, just large enough to fit a man with a pack or a pair of snowshoes. The outer door faced downhill, shielded by the slope to reduce wind pressure. The inner door opened directly into the main room, tight and flush, sealed with thick strips of canvas soaked in pine tar. Inside the vestibule, he mounted hooks for wet gear, a small shelf for gloves and tools, and a lantern bracket overhead. It became more than a transition space. It was a threshold between the storm and the sanctuary. Elijah tested it during a minor snowstorm in November. Wind howled across the valley, shrieking through the trees. He stepped outside briefly, closing the outer door behind him. When he opened the inner door, the main room was undisturbed. The fire still flickered, the warmth remained. No draft, no snow, But it wasn't just heat the airlock preserved, it was silence. The cabin didn't creak. It didn't groan under stress. There were no rattling shutters, no whistling gaps. He sat in the center of the room, listening as the wind battered everything outside, and felt as if he were submerged under still water, a world away from the chaos, wrapped in calm. Neighbors mocked the extra doorway. "You building a courthouse or a trading post?" one laughed. Elijah didn't answer. But the next week the same man returned with questions. How to seal a door frame better, how to mount hinges deep in timber instead of on the surface. Elijah showed him quietly, patiently, because that was the point. The airlock wasn't just about warmth. It was about control, about slowing things down, about not letting the wild inside every time you crossed the threshold. By winter's heart, when temperatures dropped to 20 below and the wind sounded like screams across the ridgeline, Elijah would step into that space, close both doors behind him, and feel the pressure vanish. 2 inches of pine, a wall of stone, and the wisdom of experience. That was all it took to turn a storm into silence. And silence, in the mountains, was survival. The first sign was a sound no man ever forgets, the hollow snap of wood under strain, muffled by snow, followed by a distant thunderous collapse, like a tree falling in fog. Elijah sat upright in his bed before he was fully awake. The fire had burned low. The silence that followed was thick and unnatural. Then came the wind. The blizzard had struck fast just after dusk. No warning beyond the usual bite in the air and a darkening sky. But by nightfall, it wasn't just snow falling, it was weight. Wet, heavy snow with an icy crust, piling faster than any storm Elijah had seen in 5 winters. And the wind came in bursts like waves crashing against stone, sudden, relentless. He didn't panic. He moved to the gun port near the window and opened the interior shutter just enough to see outside. What he saw turned his stomach. The ridge below, where 3 cabins sat along the tree line, was a blur of white and debris. One of the roofs had already collapsed. Smoke rose crookedly from the second, and the third. The third was gone. Just gone. Buried or shattered. Elijah couldn't tell, but he could hear voices, screaming, somewhere in the night. He threw on his coat and stepped into the airlock, opened the outer door carefully. The snow was up to his waist. The wind cut his face like razors. He couldn't go far. But he didn't need to. A shadow was already approaching, stumbling, shouting against the gale. A man dragging something, no, someone. A woman, her head wrapped in wool, face pale, unmoving. It was Josiah Merrick from the farthest cabin. "Elijah!" he shouted. We lost the roof. She's hurt. We can't stay." Elijah hauled them both into the vestibule without a word, closed the outer door, then the inner. The silence returned like a held breath. She was frostbitten, but alive. They weren't the last. Over the next hour others came, 3 from the lower ridge, 2 from the timberline cabins. A child carried on a back, a man with blood down his face. They came because there was nowhere else. Every cabin had failed, every roof had broken. The wind had tested them all, and none had held, except Elijah's. They filled the cabin, 21 souls in total. Every corner was occupied. Blankets were shared. Heat was rationed. Elijah lit a second firebox, his reserve hearth, and cooked snow to keep water flowing. No one spoke much. Not about what happened, not yet. The cabin didn't creak, didn't shift. Snow piled high above, but the roof shed it as designed. The heat held, the silence held. That night, while the storm destroyed everything else, Elijah's cabin became a lifeboat. And as wind clawed at the walls, 100 years of mistakes ended in a single moment of vindication. He hadn't built for comfort, he had built for this. By dawn, the storm was still alive. It hadn't moved on, it hadn't weakened, it sat heavy atop the valley like a wolf over a carcass, waiting, tearing, chewing at what was left. Trees stood bare and broken, their limbs snapped under the burden of ice. Wind had carved 6-foot drifts across trails, sealed cabins like tombs, and turned outhouses to frozen towers. The storm had become something beyond weather. It was an event, a judgment. But inside Elijah Cormack's cabin, there was warmth, there was silence, there was life. 21 people, crammed shoulder to shoulder, lay across the floor, shelves, and benches of a structure meant for one man. They slept fitfully, but they slept. A boy who hadn't stopped shaking since he arrived was now curled against his mother, his breath slow and steady. A man with frost-bitten fingers kept his hands under a wool wrap, his lips blue but no longer cracking. No one asked for comfort, no one complained. They simply survived. And survival was a kind of miracle. Elijah had built the cabin with that word buried in his bones. He'd never said it aloud, never prayed for it. But every notch, every peg, every sealed corner had been made with the silent hope that when the worst came, and it always did, it might not be the end. He built not to show off, not to impress, but to endure. He had built for the test, and now the test had come. He moved quietly among the sleeping, feeding the stove with small cuts of split oak, checking for drafts, wiping moisture from the inside of the shuttered window. The walls were warm to the touch. The floor, radiating the heat of buried stone, glowed faintly in the firelight. No air escaped the airlock. No sound entered. The mountain was roaring, but they could not hear it. One man stirred near the hearth, Josiah Merrick. His wife Lydia was asleep beside him, breathing shallow but even. Josiah's eyes were red from exhaustion, his face pale. "She would have died," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "If we'd stayed, she would have—" Elijah didn't reply. He simply sat beside the fire and handed him a cup of warm pine tea. "You knew this was coming," Josiah said after a long pause. "Didn't you? Maybe not this storm, but something." Elijah looked into the fire. "I knew the mountain had one like this left in it, and I knew most folks weren't building for it." Josiah nodded slowly. "We thought you were touched, building the way you did. All that time, all those extra steps, but now it makes sense." "No," Elijah said, quietly, "not yet. It will." Around them, the others began to stir. Groans, stiff limbs, eyes blinking in the soft amber glow of morning firelight. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a murmur rose. Low voices checking on each other, hands passing a cup, a child asking if the storm was gone. It wasn't. The wind still battered the walls, but it couldn't come in. Not here. A man named Owen Grady stood and stretched, rubbing a bruise on his ribs. His cabin had been the first to fall, its roof crushed like a tin kettle. He looked up at Elijah, voice rough. "You built a ship in the hills. We all thought you were crazy." "I was," Elijah said. "I still might be." Owen cracked a grin. "Well, hell, crazy kept us breathing." Laughter flickered around the room, thin but real. A kind of thaw, the beginning of understanding. That day, no one left. They couldn't. The storm remained, unpredictable and wild. But something else had shifted. Those who had survived the collapse now moved with quiet intention. They patched the firewood pile. They cleaned the melted snow pans. They adjusted wraps and bandages. The cabin, once a solitary refuge, had become a lifeboat, and everyone aboard was learning how to row. But none of them yet grasped the full truth. They didn't know how many winters Elijah had watched from the trees, studying snowdrifts and measuring wind shadows. They didn't know he had once carried his partner's broken body out of a collapsed shack and buried him beneath frozen stones, vowing never to let grief take him again. They didn't know how many designs he had scrapped, how many nights he had spent testing the angle of a roof with a string and a plumb line, or how he had shaped every log to fit with the intimacy of a carpenter building a coffin. They didn't know, but they felt it. In the stillness, in the warmth, in the way the cabin didn't groan or shift beneath the weight of the storm. Elijah never asked them to understand. He just hoped, when the snow melted and they rebuilt, they'd remember. That night the wind howled again, louder than before. But no one cried, no one begged. They slept. Inside a shelter born of memory, shaped by grief, and perfected by one man's refusal to accept that winter always wins. It ended like all storms do, not with a scream, but with a silence so profound it felt unnatural. Sometime after midnight on the fourth day, the wind fell away. The snow stopped. The valley, still blanketed and broken, held its breath. No one spoke. They waited, eyes wide in the dark, unsure whether it was another lull or the true end. But morning confirmed it. The blizzard was over. Outside, the sky was clear, ice blue, sharp, and cloudless. The sun returned, cold but brilliant, casting long golden shadows across drifts that reached the windowsills. The trees were bent and broken, paths erased. Cabins, what remained of them, jutted out of snowbanks like wreckage from a shipwreck. But Elijah's cabin stood whole. No sag, no split, no weakness exposed. Inside, the stove hissed, the stone floor radiated warmth, and 21 people began the slow process of reckoning with what they'd survived. Josiah and Lydia were among the first to leave. Using a sled, Elijah helped reinforce with spare planks. They hugged him at the airlock. Lydia tried to speak, but emotion caught in her throat. Josiah said it for her. "We're going to build again," he said. "But not like before. You showed us something." Elijah only nodded. "Come back in spring. I'll help with the frame." Others left too, some walking, some on snowshoes. One carried on a makeshift travois. Every one of them turned back at least once before descending the ridge, and every one of them looked at that strange cabin with a kind of reverence. Word spread, as it always did. By the time the thaw began, Elijah had visitors from neighboring valleys, trappers, settlers, even a foreman from the army, looking to understand why one cabin stood when the rest had failed. Elijah answered every question, showed every joint, explained the vented floor, the ribbed roof, the airlock. He held nothing back. He had no secrets. If his design saved lives, it didn't belong to him. They called it Elijah's Ark. Some said he was a prophet of snow. Others said he was just lucky. Elijah knew the truth. He hadn't outsmarted the storm. He'd just prepared for it as if it would come, because it always came, eventually. That's what the mountains taught. They didn't forgive shortcuts. They didn't care about tradition. They only respected what worked. In May, Elijah returned to the ruins of the other cabins. He helped Josiah dig a new foundation. He showed Owen how to angle beams against prevailing winds. He worked beside them with the same quiet intensity that had once been mistaken for madness. And when they asked him why he'd spent 5 winters building something no one understood, he finally answered. "I wasn't building a cabin," he said. "I was building time." They looked at him puzzled. "The kind of time you don't have when the roof comes down," he added. "Time to think, time to act, time to live." Years passed. Elijah aged. His hands stiffened. He built less, taught more. Children came to walk through the old cabin with their fathers, who whispered, "This is where it happened." They ran their fingers along the smooth joins, the thick chinking, the iron pegs driven through corner beams. They didn't know the storm, not truly. But they knew the shelter it couldn't break. Elijah Cormack died one winter evening many years later, peacefully, under the same roof he had built with his own hands. The stove burned low, snow tapped gently at the shutter, and the silence was complete. They buried him just down the hill, where the ridge opened toward the valley. On his stone, they carved no grand title, just words he had once spoken, long, before anyone believed him. "Don't build for comfort, build for the storm." And so they did.